I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I am joining you tonight from the land of the Kulin Nation. I pay respect to the elders past, present, and to the elders of all community this conversation reaches. This event is presented in partnership by the Wheeler Centre and Melbourne Writers Festival, and supported by the City of Melbourne, the Victorian Government, and ABC Radio Melbourne. My name is Jacinta Parsons, and I am so excited to be here to celebrate writing and independent bookstores in this incredible city of Melbourne, and to remember that we will be together soon, hanging out in bookstores, asking our booksellers what books we should be reading. But until then, they have done an incredible job in making sure that we have books and that our wonderful writers who are releasing books during this time are well loved and cared for, and we get an opportunity to hear from them during this time. And one such author who has been selected to be our very first Melbourne City Reads author. She's already won a slew of awards, and this is the debut book. I've got lots of dog ears on it because I've read it heartily, as have many people that I know and love. And there's been so much already wonderful feedback on this debut book. Allee Richards joins us this afternoon today to talk to us about this book. Firstly, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the Wheeler Centre.
Debut, I mean, my goodness, that's quite a thing to experience for you. How has this been? We've released it during a pandemic and all the stuff that we hear about. How's the experience? Because I'm sure it's quite an emotional one.
Yeah, and in lockdown, like everything, the emotions are like 10 times heightened. It was definitely a strange experience, because it's probably a dream I've had and been working towards for about 10 years. And then, it's happened during the pandemic. So it's sort of this difficult thing, and my bread and butter works in the performing arts. So that really, my other professional part of my life sort of feels like it's collapsing. So it's a weird two things to have happening at once. But in a positive way to look at it is that it has given me some joy during this really hard time that we're going through.
And we should say small joys of real life are being experienced right now by so many of us. I've got so many questions, not only about this book, but you as a writer. It's already interesting to hear that this has been 10 years in the making. I guess we'll get to that in a moment and talk about the process that this book has undergone. But I guess let's kick off with a bit of an overview. From your perspective, because everyone's got a vibe on what this book is about. What is this book about? What did you intend to write 10 years ago?
I came up with the premise. So before I think of any thematic content or think about character, really, it started with the premise. So the premise, for those who haven't read it, is a young woman named Eva who's in her late 20s. She has a one-night stand with a man named Pat. A few weeks after that, she finds out that he's died. He's taken his own life. And a few weeks after that, she finds out she's pregnant with his child. So I found that quite dramatic sort of premise. And then I started writing from there this fairly slow day-to-day life book. And the thematic content that came from that, I think it was sort of about this time at life where her and her good friends, they're all university educated and they've all started their careers. And then they've all realised that that's not making them happy, and that maybe this idea that the secret to life, or like the solution or the sum of life, is a job plus a partner plus kids equals happiness. Maybe that's not actually what it is, or maybe it is, or they can't find it or something. So about then reassessing, if you're not going to go down a conventional path, then where are you going to find your joys? Or if you are going to go down the conventional path, where would you find your joys within that as well?
Yeah, that's also such an interesting thing to think about, because this book, as you say, the premise is it's a big one, but it juts up against the banality of the everyday, kind of like it always happens. The big stories are always set in an everyday place. Was that also very conscious of you?
I think so. I mean, I think that's the most realistic depiction of life I've found. You know, really dramatic and horrid things happen. They happen, but unlike a soap opera, it's rare for them to back up on each other and happen like every month like they do on Ramsay Street or in Summer Bay or something. It's usually like something happens, and then one of the hardest things about that is that you actually have to go to work. Like you do have to go and do your groceries and go to work after that. So it's how you're sort of working through the banality of life. Yeah.
And banality is kind of the right word, but also not, because as you point out, I guess, what one of the things is in this book, it's the small joys, it's the tiny moments, it's the micro, it's how do you go to work is also part of the really interesting aspect of who we are as people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the title from the book came from a Laurie Moore quote from a story of hers called Joy. She's an American short story writer, and I might get the quote wrong, but it was she knew there were only small joys in life because the big ones were too complicated to be joys once you got all through.
So true. I'm going to cry all the way through this because every revelation is so keenly felt at the moment. I mean, that's an interesting part of releasing a book like this in a time, and, you know, this will date this in some ways, but I think significantly in that we are in a pandemic and we're locked in and all that sort of stuff is going on. We keenly feel the world perhaps the way we might not have before. And this book is beautiful for that because it really picks at the cotton, you know, of our everyday existence.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting actually because I started writing it pre-pandemic and I wrote the draft that was submitted to my publisher. It was all written in 2019, so without any knowledge of this world that we would live in. But then I did work on the edits last year during stage 4 lockdown. So I think that there is a bit of that in there. You know, I think that it did start to colour the text. And, you know, I remember actually finding it really hard to think, what am I going to do with a character if she doesn't have a job? And then because, as I said before, I work in performing arts, so I haven't had a job much for the last 2 years. Like, so last year I was like, oh, okay, now I know what you do when you don't have a job.
Yeah, well schooled in all of the aspects that, you know, she went through, I guess, yeah. I mean, there was, reading it, I've got so much to say about this, and we'll talk about, you know, place in a moment, but the characters go through Melbourne in such a beautiful way. They're at the tote in the way we may never be at the tote again. You talk about us being jammed up and sweating and not being able to actually go to each other because there's so many people in the bar. It feels like an important document in a way of a time before maybe, and hopefully we will get there again, but it is such a unique part of what we just took for granted.
Totally. And I mean, if we do get there again, though, it will be, you know, even if the restrictions lifted tomorrow and COVID ceased to exist, I think I would still feel weird about standing really close to heaps of people in a packed space, even if the disease wasn't there anymore. Like my learning is to sort of be more fearful of that situation. So, yeah.
I know. And again, just so beautiful. What I really loved, obviously, and it's been written about a lot in response to this book. We'll get it out of the way. You've been likened deeply to Helen Garner, one of the greatest writers and one of the greatest books that is treasured by so many people, Monkey Grip, because of the way that you've written about Melbourne specifically, but also place. And she wrote about, she spoke about the fact that when she wrote about Melbourne, than when she did during Monkey Grip, that it was so looked down upon because Australian audiences don't want to read about the boring place that Australia is. But she brought it to life in the way that you have. How conscious was it, or was it very natural that place became such an important part in this book?
Before I wrote the novel, I was a short story writer, or, you know, I still occasionally write short stories, but I'd been working on short stories for years, and I used to try and invent settings in my head, and it was really hard. And one day I had sort of an epiphany, but I think every writer figured this out before me, that if you just base it somewhere that's real and you know, then you it's really easy to describe it because you know the place, so you don't have to invent it or anything. And I started having a lot of fun writing about bars that I went to or cafes that I went to where I based a story in my friend's house, and you could get these tiny little details in there. So it was really I guess it's just easiest, and you can write with the most nuance about a place that you know really well. I certainly admire writers who write about places that they don't know, but it's actually something that doesn't interest me at all. I would not at all want to write a book or a story set somewhere I've never been. I just think any amount of research I could do, I would never feel like I really had access to it.
Yeah, because the way that you have written about it has excited so many readers. And I don't think they necessarily have to be Melbourne experiencing to feel the city. It's such a beautiful way that you've written it. And what I really like about this, I think, is that unlike, Monkey Grip told us about Melbourne of a certain time, but Small Joys of Real Life tells us about a Melbourne kind of now. And there are different kids walking the streets and living in share houses, and there is such a mirroring of the same kind of experiences, but they're new and different people. And I love that about that as well, that modern Melbourne idea. But the idea that the 86 tram, Helen Gardner would never have imagined going all the way up High Street the way that you have. Melbourne that you wrote about has changed as well since the time you wrote this book.
Yeah, 100%. There's a line in the early pages of the book about how if you catch the tram from Preston to Northcote or Northcote to Preston, the 86 along High Street, you see the various stages of gentrification, with like Preston being in the book says pre-gentrification and Thornbury's in the middle, and then Northcote's like turbo. And I wrote that in 2017, and then when we were about to go to print, I was suddenly like reading it for the first time being like, that is so wrong. Like Preston's so gentrified now. Like the houses in Thornbury are over $1 million. Like it's wrong. But it was sort of it already almost feels dated in that sense. So it's, and then, it's interesting, the constant evolving of a place.
But a beautiful capturing. It's an archive. It's something we put in our time machine because, and again, I've spoken to so many people about this book, the way that you've written about Joe's shoe store or the tote or, the different places. Like, that bartender that gave Eva and Travis the drinks, like all of those things are absolutely beautiful. There's been really interesting conversations recently around books that have a strong sense of place. We see a lot of our wonderful Indigenous writers really embedding their work in place. Where does it fit in the hierarchy for you in terms of character, place? Are you always, obviously knowing that place is really important to you, but how important is it within the story itself?
I think usually when I'm writing, I'm mostly thinking about character over plot and thinking about tension and where is the tension for the character or the characters and where's the tension going. So place is a really important backdrop to kind of give energy and give ambience to a piece, but I wouldn't say that it's not as much of a main focal point as other books where place is maybe more of a centre part of the story. Yeah, I'd say it's, almost like the backdrop or the scaffolding or something.
You're right. It's a beautiful idea to describe it as atmosphere.
Yeah.
It's a tone, it's a tension, it's all sorts of things that you can do with that place. Sitting in gutters, all the ways Eva found her way around the city adds a dimension to her character as well.
It's been really lovely. I hope that it shows in the book that I really love Melbourne and I love the inner north. And I've had a lot of really lovely messages from people as well saying how they loved seeing their neighbourhood in the book. So it's been really great.
More of it, I'd say. It's hyper real. So there's, because we've got all of those touchstones as well, they're real places. The characters are very real, the way you've drawn them in their complexity. First question I have about that is you release a book like this and you get phone calls saying, am I, Eva, am I Pat? Which one am I? Have you had to have some awkward conversations about which conversations have ended up in the book or you know, all sorts of things?
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, I have been writing for a while. So I had the short stories published and I've had 2 plays on and stuff. So I'm not, even though this is my first novel, I'm not new to the experience of writing something and having people to respond to it. And I said to a friend before I gave her the book, I was like, I'm nervous for everyone to read it because I know from past experience that everyone is an archetype, right? So the characters all fit under archetypes. And we as people all fit under archetypes. So if you see that that's your archetype, then you might think that that's you. But a lot of the nuances and the details aren't there. And so I knew that people would say, my friends would stop talking about the characters by their character names and they'd start calling them by our friends' names. And I would, you know, eventually you stop correcting them because you find it a bit exhausting and you're worried that that friend might get offended or something. And I said this to a friend, I was like, I'm nervous for people to read it because I know that they're going to start doing that. And she was like, that's crazy. No one would do that. No one would do that. And then as soon as she read it, she rang me and she was like, when did I say that to you? I was like, she never said that to me. It's fiction. It's like, it just, and look, I don't blame, I'm actually just so grateful that none of my friends or family hate me. So, or that they're all still speaking to me. So it's, you know, I would never just base someone completely off someone, but it's just that we all have archetypes that we fit under.
I love that idea too, that it happens in the other way, where you might have a dramatic moment in life with someone and they go, are you going to write about this?
Oh, yeah, 100%. People say that all the time. I had a friend who sent a funny message the other day. They said, I think I'm 3 parts Annie and 1 part Sarah. I was like, oh, that's nice.
Okay. Nice for you to think that. I think you're more 3 parts Sarah, but, you know. Look, I think actually this might be a really nice time for us to hear you read from Small Joys of Real Life. Have you got a section that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm going to read a part that is near the beginning of the book. And the reason I've decided to read this part is because it's actually the first words I ever wrote when I first sat down to start writing. It's edited a bit from that day, but yeah, it was the idea is there. Okay. The most painful thing about acting is that people mistake it for being interesting. Acting in theatre is as repetitive as working in the same cafe every day, except worse, because you serve everyone the exact same meal at the exact same time. In this analogy, television work is the equivalent of someone ordering something then sending it back to you, so that you have to repeat the entire process, beginning with hello, anywhere from 20 to 60 times. I've always known how to act. The secret is not to learn. Go. I snap my fingers and I act. I never understood colleagues who before a performance would do yoga or stutter their way through the alphabet. An actor I once worked with would walk up and down the rows of the auditorium, occasionally stopping at a particular seat to say an ex-boyfriend's name. D25 was Derek and B17 was Robert. She walked every row like this in a fabricated ritual. I studied classical ballet when I was growing up. That demands preparation. It's learned in excruciating increments and is absurdly precise. It's actually grotesque what the dancers do with their bodies, but it looks beautiful. Almost nobody is good enough to do it professionally. I wasn't. When I failed my first audition to study dance, they told me I should audition for the acting stream. I never wanted to act, but I wanted a reason to stay in Melbourne with my friends, so I auditioned and I got in, and now that's the story of my life so far. The one I told Pat when I first met him. I've got almost every role I've applied for since. Auditions are like dates. If you reek of desperation, it's over before it begins. The same as walking on stage. Just act. Now. Do it. Newspapers love to call Eva McMillan the one actor who kept the drowning ship afloat. I saved the show. I made the show. For years I was told I was the show. For a while I believed, like everyone else, that I have some special talent because I couldn't see it then what I see now. That what I have, which is so special, was actually what I didn't have. A fuck to give.
That's a fantastic line. Did you just go, yes, this is going to be good?
Not at that stage, no.
I'm so interested to talk about your writing process as well. But it's Eva as a character. I'd love to talk to you about her. She's our main driving force through this book, and she's flawed. It's really interesting to have her as an actor. I just said actor. as an actor, because obviously you're really bringing to the front there these ideas of the outside, expectations and what people see and how we really feel about ourselves. And you have a very seemingly intimate knowledge of actors. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Well, as I said before, I work in the performing arts. I know how bad this sounds, so I'm just going to say that before I say it. But I actually think I could have been an actor. And I hate it when people say that, because whenever anyone tells me, like, oh, I always thought I could have been a writer, it's like, well, if you could have been one, you would be one. Like, you would just be doing it. But I guess I sort of I have this like part desire that, I never pursued it because I pursued writing. And yeah, I work in the performing arts, but I actually love acting. I think it's fascinating as a craft. I think it's very similar into writing in that you get a script and then you've got to fill in, you've got to colour in underneath that. And I kind of think that's what writers do, in that we get a premise and then we colour. It's the process of shading it in and colouring it. And you can get a bad character and try and make them redeemable, or you can get a typically nice character but try and give them some depth or difference. And so I think there's a similar craft there. It's been a very interesting experience though, because I had absolutely no expectation that all my colleagues would be as supportive as they've been. So I've gotten so many messages from people I work with who've read the book, and I'm like, oh God, I'm sorry, I don't hate your job. Like actors that I work with, I'm like, I hope you're not offended.
Well, they just like, right on, you're so right about actors.
Yeah.
So I guess what she does for us is, we see underneath that veneer, and it's really interesting that she sees herself as well on the TV before this time. She looks so skinny. She was a different person, and having these ideas of who she is in the outside world are very different to how she feels.
Yeah. And then that's sort of, I guess, a little bit mirrored in the experience that she has, because the father of her baby is someone that she doesn't know. And so she's trying to access him through this image, or like whatever image she can capture of him from social media. And she's very aware, though, that the image that other people get of her is very not real to what her experience is. So, yeah.
She's really flawed. And it was really interesting to see Fergus describe her when he was a bit annoyed with her, one of the characters. I'll just bring it up. People who are about to read this book will understand it. But when you're described from the outside of yourself, and he said, I've been defending you when everyone calls you a bitch, how you've been able to balance with some of these characters that are flawed, that they're still likeable and still characters that we care about.
It's interesting. I had a desire to write kind of an arrogant female character. There's been a lot, in a lot of millennial novels like this one there's a lot of self-effacing and meek young women. And I think that's because most writers are those things. They're more Annies who are narrating books. And I sort of just wanted to do something different. I was like, I want to make like a female Holden Caulfield, like someone who's really arrogant. And she was actually a lot more obnoxious in the early drafts. The publisher helped me kind of wind her back a bit and get some, because she's allowed to be obnoxious, but the reader still has to be on her side a bit. And I actually think the way that I've able to bring her on side is that I don't think Eva is actually always as bad as she is in this 1 year that's in this book. It's a bad time. The reader's caught her at a bad time, and she's really struggling. So her internal thoughts are really negative. But she, I don't think that she's actually always been that bad. I don't think she even hates acting that much. I think she's just basically in a bad mood for the whole year that this book is set in. It's been interesting too, though, the character of Sarah. Initially, when the book was published, because Sarah had, struggles with alcoholism, and I had a lot of initial readers kind of tell me how annoying they found her and how much they disliked her, and I started getting worried that I'd failed there a bit, because I do really like Sarah. But then I had a friend who read it and he said Sarah was his favourite character. So I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. As long as one person saw it, it's good. That's fine.
There's two. I really like Sarah. I think Sarah, we all know Sarah, a Sarah who's just such a great mate, but also fucks up the whole time.
Yeah. A friend of mine put it really well. She said, I think Sarah could have been any of my friends at their worst.
Yeah. And we've all got that, and we all are that as well, I think. It's interesting. I'm so fascinated about this millennial novel idea because it is a genre of its own right now, almost. Like it has its own tenets and flavours and ideas that it looks to explore. You've obviously been put into that category as well. And meaningless is a word that has come up a lot in the reviews, not about the book, but about the characters' exploits, it's meaningless lives that are being explored, people trying to find meaning, I suppose. How would you describe this expanse of time, the millennial, characters?
First I would just say that I don't, it's not like I sort of get up every day and I think I'm a millennial, the same way I don't really think like I'm a woman or I'm, it is just my experience. So no matter what I write from my own experience, it's always kind of going to be in that. But I guess that meaningless is a really interesting kind of word to bring up in that context because I think, as I said earlier, I think it's that the millennial experience in a lot of these books is that search for meaning beyond job plus partner plus kids equals happiness. And, every generation has its struggles and every generation has its difference. And I guess for mine, I think because house prices are astronomical and climate change is here, the family and kids one really seems to be a lot harder and a lot less obvious, I think, for my generation than it has been before maybe. So it's like, how do you search for meaning in this world? And even, as I said earlier, even if you want those things, even if you do get the fancy career and the family, you're going to have to find meaning without that as well. I kind of want to just debunk the idea that any life, you can have a fancy job or you can have a not fancy job and you can be single or you can have a partner, you can have children or not children. All lives are equally as meaningful to me. I think everyone needs to find their own meaning.
It's interesting too, that exploration of meaning and how central and important and interesting the way you write about female friendships. And I delighted in reading it because, I'm a generation, surprising as that might be, beyond where you are. And for me to read about those friendships resonated so deeply, and they're of a time. Tell me what your reflection was in terms of writing about these three friends.
It's essentially a love letter to my friends, and which is a funny one because people keep asking me about how honest it is and how annoyed they get with each other or how awful they are to each other or things like that, which I think is obviously true and true of any friendship. But I guess that's part of the love letter for me, is to be honest about it. And, there are hard times, but my female friends have probably been my strongest. I don't know how I would have gotten by in all of my 20s without them, and they kind of are your family. Before, I still don't have a conventional family, but they are your family. Really, they were my family of my 20s, my friends. So I love them, and it's just a love letter to them, really.
And do you think, because often then what happens is life gets in the way, potentially, people go and get big jobs and the things that you were describing before as being elusive to this generation, do you think those female friendships have a different potential than perhaps female friendships, of ye olde days did? Do you think there is more legs in them, more substance, more extension to those experiences of that closeness, of that daily inhabitation?
It's interesting. I was asked another question in another interview recently. It wasn't the same, but it was something to do with how it sort of compares for another generation of my own. And I started to answer it, and then halfway through answering it, I just thought, you can't speak for that generation. You have absolutely no idea what they thought. So I really don't know. Like, I can't say.
Yeah.
if my experience is different to any other generation. What I can say in response to that question, though, is that because I'm 31, I'm 31 or 32. And so for a lot of my, some people I know have had kids recently, and then I guess everyone else is questioning whether they're going to do it. And so there is a huge, it almost feels like there's a ticking time bomb on the life that I've been living for 10 years, because even if I don't do it, if someone else does it, it does change your whole relationship. And I definitely think I have friends that I'll stay friends with when we have kids, but I'm very aware that it'll completely fundamentally change the whole dynamic. And so it is sort of like you're standing on the edge of this huge change that's going to happen in your life and the lives around you. And I don't know what it's going to look like yet. So maybe that'll be the book I write in 10 years.
I'm so interested in that. It's a fascinating conversation to have a consciousness around that. The precipice that you all stand on in terms of potential change to those relationships. The other relationship that Eva has is with a dead man. And, this book is talking directly to him some of the time. He creates a very interesting potential for both the reader and for Eva to fill in that gap. How well did you know Pat as the creator of Pat before you wrote about him? Or did he develop, and does he still remain a mystery a bit to you?
I think still remains a mystery, yeah, because you never see anything bad about him. No. It's he's kind of the only guy in the book that really comes off very, very well, because it's all coloured by her sort of rose-coloured glasses. I didn't know much about him at all, and I think when we went through the edits, there were the most inconsistencies that came up with him that were like, oh, in this chapter he had this job and now he has this job, and this time he lived here and then he lived there and he had this colour hair and then it's that, and which is quite reflective, I suppose, of it being written from Eva's perspective, that there's not, she doesn't know him, so it's all extremely surface level.
Yeah, and then so much potential, as you say, for him to be the hero of all of our stories. We think about him in a particular way because he's not alive to stuff that up. Yeah, I'm sort of, it's a really complicated thing though, because then obviously he had an extremely hard life because he obviously suffered very badly from mental illness. And so it's a difficult thing because realistically his life would have been a lot bleaker than Eva can really even comprehend. And I guess I'm worried about sort of writing and romanticising that at all, which I suppose is a problem with books where it's sort of like I'm willing to admit that it's bad that the book, it's sort of like the suicide happens to help a whole lot of other mentally well people come to a realisation, which isn't a good narrative thing really. Like it's probably better that there are more books where the actual grit of depression is kind of in the pages, which this isn't this book, but yeah. But it does help us reflect on that exact thing. The way that he's mythologized by Eva is kind of what we do, where we don't really deal with the complexity of mental health and the way it is. And that's actually what it was for me, an awareness that there was a glossing over by her of the truth of the experience.
Yeah, 100%. And I suppose that is, I can't say plot spoilers, but I suppose she does get a little bit closer up to that toward the end, I think.
Yeah. We'll keep that for reading Small Joy of Real Life when you get to it. As you've said, you've been writing for a really long time, but I guess how different was this experience as a writer, writing the entire book in the way that you have?
Certainly different to writing plays because you don't... in a whole bunch of good ways, you don't have to hire a rehearsal space or get a venue or get, technicians and find money to pay them and everything. So there's a lot of logistics that I didn't have to deal with because I had a publisher. But then I think because I've been writing short stories for a long time, when I first started to write the novel, I was like, oh my God, it's going to be entirely different. I almost felt like I'd never written before. I felt like I just didn't know what I was doing. And then when I got really late in the process, I realised it wasn't actually that different to writing a short story. You just have to go with your gut, go with your instinct, feel where you're going, follow the heat each day. And that's definitely my way of writing. It's very much off instinct. Whenever I tried to plan or plot anything, I just got these really terrible subplots that were awful.
Beautiful. Did you say you follow the heat?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. What does that mean?
It means, so, I mean, when I say I don't plan, I have, a vague idea of where, like in this book, for instance, I knew the final scene in the book. That was very clear in my mind at the beginning. I knew where I was going. I knew a few points, a few big scenes that I had to get to. And so you might sit down to write one day and you're like, this is the next scene I'm going to write. And then you might be doing something and you'll be like, actually, no, they're going to continue this conversation a little bit longer, or we're going to go over here now. We're going to see this character. And I will just go with that. I'll never stop myself going off on I never stop myself if I get distracted looking at something. It's sort of like if you're walking through a gallery or something and there's like a way that you're meant to go through, but then you might see some other room. I would never be like, like, don't go in there. I'd always just go. Like, go wherever looks most interesting to you.
That sounds like an incredible creative experience to undertake. Is it always a pleasure to write for you?
It often is. I do find it gives me a pleasure I do really love it. I absolutely love it. I always worry that everyone else who knows me in my life thinks that I'm very vague and a bit away with the fairies, because I do daydream quite a bit, and I'm often thinking of the book when I'm doing more sort of monotonous tasks or something like that. But obviously, writing comes with its trials. You've got to have a lot of time to do it. Most writers in Australia don't make a lot of money, so you've got to fit it in around your other work. There's a lot of sitting at desks. There's a lot of looking at screens. There's a lot of comparing your shortlistings or your sales to another writer. Like there's hard parts of it, but ultimately I keep going back to it because I love it.
Doubt is something I've loved talking to writers about, because it feels like, from what I can gather, it's such an oscillating experience to play with doubt, because, as you say, you have to follow instincts and you've got to go with where you feel is right to go. Does doubt play much of a role in your experience of writing?
It does. And I do think you can't pummel into despair, but sometimes doubt is a valid emotion to feel, and sometimes writer's block is a valid emotion to feel. So if you're feeling like you don't want to write that day, maybe you shouldn't write. And it's really hard because you don't really want to say that to beginning writers, because then they might not get anything done. But I think also when I started out, there were so many people that were like, it's a job and you've got to do it and you've got to sit down. And so I didn't follow my instinct on the times when maybe it's just not the time now. And, like if you are struggling with the pandemic, or sometimes you've just got to work really hard, or you might have a really stressful situation going on, or you're going through a breakup or something, like it's fine to also feel that. In terms of the sort of self-confidence issues and stuff, though, around rejection and everything, I made this equation when I was writing short stories, because it's very hard to publish short stories, and there's a lot of rejection involved. And so I used to just do this thing where I think anytime I got a rejection, I was allowed 15 minutes to be upset about it. And then I had to think of all the things in my life are good that rejection didn't affect. So usually it would be like my relationships with my friends or my family, or something I was really looking forward to. I might be going to a gig that weekend or going to a friend's birthday or something, and I'd think that how much fun I'm going to have at that event is not affected by this rejection. And you think of everything in your life that's unaffected by it, and it starts to feel quite small in comparison then.
That is the best I've ever heard. Does it work?
It really does, because it actually starts making you look at, like, if you write up all the family members you love, or your friends that you love, or the dinner you're going to eat that night. I mean, our joys right now, like, I'm not going to any gigs or parties on the weekend, obviously. But
I love your joys right now. They'll be like walking for 2Ks for half an hour.
Yeah. 10Ks at the end of the month. But when you start writing down everything that the rejection, like someone's mean Goodreads review doesn't affect, it really does sort of put into light how small that is in the equation of your entire life.
And just the need, isn't it, to really stay very close to the art and the art that you make and why you're doing it and how it's being made, so that it's very easy to push you off or to unsettle, I think, isn't it? So keeping that clarity is beautiful to hear. That's wonderful. I'm interested too just about editing. You said this book started 10 years ago?
Oh, no, I just started writing 10 years ago.
Oh, how long ago was this book? When did you? I was like, 21?
I came up with the idea in 2017, but I did most of the writing of it, like the actual punching the words into the page, in 2019.
Yeah. How about the editing process for you? The process where writer meets editor and you tussle over commas and construction. Did you find that a really helpful thing to be in a collaboration like that, or are you a different kind of writer that likes to really kind of hone it by yourself?
I definitely need to have something as good as I can get it before I show it to anyone. I'm definitely not someone who can bash out a first draft and then share it. It would be completely pointless of me to do that, because I'd have so much that I took issue in it that I wouldn't be able to even see the other person's perspective. But yeah, the editing experience was really, really great overall. I really loved my publisher at Hachette Australia, and I had one editor. I worked with a few different editors, but I had one editor called Rebecca Allen who was with me the whole way from beginning to end, and she was excellent. It was thorough and thoughtful, and yeah, it was really great. I mean, sometimes you get the experience where you'll think, oh no, that's not right, and then 30 seconds later you're like, oh, it is right.
Okay. I'll take it out.
There's usually, even if their solution isn't the right solution, they've highlighted a significant, like a legitimate problem. So you've got to acknowledge the problem.
Yeah, it's confronting but also wonderful, isn't it, to have that level of creative insight and support outside of your own, what is very an isolated kind of art experience to have. I'm also interested to know what are you up to? Because this book was written, well, as you say, most of the words were punched out in 2019. Editing went through the pandemic, and we're now at publication. Fantastic accolades. We're all excited about Allee Richards and her fiction writing. Have you started another one? Are you that sort of writer as well, where it's just a constant creation?
Yeah, I'm a workaholic. So yeah, I'm working on the second novel at the moment, and it's similar to this one a bit, but it's in contrast to this one. It spans about 10 years, and it's written in third person and it's written in past tense. So I feel like I'm doing a whole different thing. So it's really fun. I'm right at the beginning at the. I don't even have a full draft of it yet, even though I've drafted a few sections of it a few times. So yeah, I'm right at the moment where I realised plot holes that I had it in the other day, so I have to go back to the beginning again and re-edit again. So yeah, I'm really enjoying being back at that end of the process.
Exciting. It's actually lovely to be at the beginning and at the end simultaneously. You're celebrating the completion of one book, whilst also really maintaining a little foot in what it is all about in the first place, is that sitting in a room and writing.
Yeah, and I mean, to go back to sort of the survival aspect, I think that probably really helps being stuck into another project as well, because if I wasn't, I might just be sitting around at home searching my own name on Google or something. So at least there's like a few hours of the day that I'm not doing that because I'm working on the next one.
Yeah, I know. There's actually a very good distraction. We've actually got a couple of audience questions that I'm just going to throw your way. This one, which I'm really excited about. I mean, we've sort of talked about it. You've mentioned that you had an idea for this book, but the question here from the audience is, where did the inspiration for this book come from? Where that fundamental plot idea, where was it?
I did a story workshop a couple of years ago, it would have been in 2017, with a writer called Jennifer Mills, who just published a book called The Airways. She's a great Australian writer. And at the time that I did that workshop, she was the fiction editor of Overland. And I asked her in the fiction class, when you're reading the submissions for Overland, what's the kind of story that you read that as soon as you read it, you roll your eyes and you decline it without even finishing it? And she said stories about people who regret getting abortions. And so then I went home from that and I thought, I wonder if I could write a story about someone who got an abortion and it was like the best thing they ever did. Like they were so happy about it. It was like the best decision ever, which is definitely not what I wrote. But from that, I got the scene with the two girls in the car going to get the abortion, which is one of the earliest. It's actually the first scene in the book after the prologue. So I had that scene and I had the two girls in the car and I was hearing their dialogue and I was seeing it all. And then I just thought, well, how can I make it more dramatic? The other one's pregnant too, but the other one doesn't realise. How can I make that even more dramatic? The father of the baby's not there. So that was where it came from.
That's great. How exciting. I love to hear that you are also seeing it and seeing and hearing the dialogue. It's a beautiful insight. And this is another fantastic question. Which writers is Allee most inspired by?
I really love, I said before the title came from a Laurie Moore short story. She is one of the writers that I love most. I think she just completely changed my idea of what writing can do. I really love comedy in writing. So a lot of comedic writers, I like Julie Coe and I like Benjamin Law and I like Tom Cho, Elizabeth Tan. And I find they're comedic writers and their writing's funny sort of in the way that seeing a really good stand-up comedian is funny. Like you go there wanting it to be funny and then it is, so it's satisfying. And Laurie Moore's humour is so intricately woven in her work. It's more like you're spending time with a friend who incidentally happens to be hilarious, and it's just really funny. And I think that she's just got the most unique voice, and I really love her. So she was a huge one. And there's probably way too many more to mention, but a few Australian ones, Peggy Frew, Ellen Van Niven, Josephine Rowe.
Yeah, we're pretty spoiled, aren't we, in this country, in the city even, for some of the most incredible writers. Do you think we've got a good writing culture that we support each other, emerging writers, and ensure that there are new voices being heard all the time?
I think it's good. I used to, from the outside, you can be a little bit afraid of the writing industry. It's sort of like looking at the cool group or something and you think like, oh, they're all friends and I'm not good enough. But my experience is that, when you do meet people in real life, they're all really friendly and really nice. And everyone's really happy to chat to you online. I mean, most of our interaction in the last 2 years has been online, but then when you see people in real life, they're all really nice as well. It's of course not without its problems, and there have been some really good conversations happening in the last couple of years about how white the writing industry is and how white the publishing industry is, and they're really good, and there's some steps being made to make that better, and there's still a long way to go, but I think we have a lot of hope that it's getting better. Hopefully.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, at least beginning with a consciousness and then stepping in one more direction. I reckon I've got one more question for you. It has been so beautiful to be able to talk to you about your writing and this book that is going to be treasured by many, many readers. It tells us this beautiful story about these characters, but also, really the lovely detail about Melbourne, I think, is going to be really special for a lot of people. And a little archive going, remember when we used to? And I mentioned to somebody before, music is such a huge part of this book as well. And it's almost you can't write a Melbourne book without having a sense of what that is.
Probably not, no. Yeah. It's a huge part of our city. And I tried to keep most of the writers who are mentioned in there are from Melbourne. But I know now that I've said that there's surely most of the musicians I mentioned in the book are from Melbourne. I think there's probably one in there that isn't, but most of them are Melbourne musicians.
And deeply loved, and it's lovely to have that recognised in here too. All right, just for anyone who's tuning in today who's starting out writing like you did 10 years ago, what's the thing that has meant that you've been able to do what you have, short stories, plays, this debut book? Is it just a commitment to this craft, or what is it for you that you would say to anyone that's wanting to find a bit of inspiration about how to ensure that they keep going and keep working?
Find a bread and butter job that you don't hate, because it doesn't get a lot of money, and I can't live off my writing. And so if I had loathed my job, then the success of my book would represent to me still being trapped in a job that I don't like. And then I think writing would become negative, and it would be this like feedback loop of failure. So I went to TAFE and I got a trade and got a good job. So go to TAFE. I'll just find out what the job is that you're going to do on the side, and then work on your creativity on the side.
I can see you now being on all the TAFE posters saying, go to TAFE.
Go to TAFE.
You've been a very good advocate for it. What a joy. I feel so very lucky to have had a chance as part of the Melbourne City Reads program. Big thanks to Wheeler Centre and everybody who supported this conversation to happen. This is the book, Allee Richards, Small Joys of Real Life. It's a cracker. Thanks very much, Allee, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jacinta, for all your wonderful questions. Thanks to the Wheeler Centre for having us, and thanks everyone who tuned in.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.